Thank you very much, Vicky, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Walker. I'm head of marketing for RT7Digital, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. As Vicky has already said, we've been in this business for a while. We've been helping brands directly for over 6 years in the Amazon environment. And ourselves, we've had our own brands, which we've been managing for over 10 years in the environment. So we've cut our teeth. And today we're going to impart some of our knowledge in an area that we feel has real big potential for clients to claw back some money. So just the agenda today, we're going to cover shortages and chargebacks. We're also going to be looking at Amazon seller fees, Amazon co-ops, Amazon terms, and then we're going to go into Q&A. So all in all, 25 minutes. Stephen is our Amazon expert who has graciously given us his time today. He will be taking you through the detail. So I'll hand you over to Stephen without any further ado.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so jumping straight into what are recoveries and how different parts of recoveries are defined. So this is looking at both Amazon vendor and Amazon seller. So I'll split out which ones apply to which, so I go through them and what they mean. So shortages. So shortages are honestly better labeled as stock discrepancies. So this is something that happens predominantly on vendor. It does happen on seller as well, but they're handled very differently. So I'll split out the two as I go through them. So shortages or stock discrepancies on vendor. If you have a vendor account, you'll have seen this. You accept purchase orders, you fulfill purchase orders, and then Amazon says out of the 10, 20 units that they expected to receive, they only received half of them. What this then leads Amazon to do is to only pay for the half that they say they've received. They'll credit off the half that they say they haven't received, and then at some point in the future, they will pay out a partial amount and then a partial amount again, and you end up with an invoice trail with their SCR stacked onto the end of the invoices that stands for shortage claim reversal. And that can happen a number of times. The longest I've ever seen is 14 instances of that SCR stacked on at the end. And the thing that Amazon then does at the end of all of this is make it so that that final invoice isn't even actually searchable in the system. So you end up with amounts of money that you can't even track properly within the system, which is the stock discrepancy piece. Mostly this happens due to a software that Amazon introduced a couple of years ago called Smart Matching. And that smart matching software is moving stock between purchase orders based on how long those purchase orders have been open, which is why you'll see things like impossible shortages where I hear companies all the time say, I only ship in packs of 6. If they've received 4 or 5, it's physically impossible. And it's because they didn't physically receive 4 or 5. They physically received 6, but they've allocated 4 on one order and 2 on another. And they don't give you that internal mapping. So it's really a jigsaw puzzle piece to try and work out where stock has ended up. And I'll go a bit more into shortages and the other ways that stock can end up in a minute when we move into the other slides. On seller, shortages is a little bit different, and it comes only on FBA when it's seller, and it's when you put the stock into FBA and you have that full pallet of stock that you sent in, and out of, let's say, 500, 1,000 units, it's usually a much smaller discrepancy on seller, but you can still see a couple of units missing. And similarly to vendor, you do have an opportunity there to say, actually, I shipped in my full shipment of items. And again, you can push for them to pay out on those a similar way. Biggest difference between the two is on seller, you actually have a time cap for how long you have to go back and dispute that. So on vendor, you can go back multiple years over the stock discrepancies on the shortages piece. But for the FBA piece, it's more like 90 days. You have a very short window really to challenge those. So moving on to the second one on this list, we've got the co-ops piece. So this is an exclusive one to vendor. So co-ops are the agreements that Amazon puts onto the vendor account to provide certain services such as damage allowance, overstock allowance, marketing allowance. And there are a couple of things that come up that cause some discrepancies within these. And I'll go more into those further into the presentation, but that's one that's exclusively to vendor. Then chargebacks, if you have a vendor account, you'll definitely be familiar with the term chargebacks. These are the fines and penalties that Amazon put into place to charge for the various infractions that they see on the account. Now, because they are a fine for breaking a policy, they're usually, in terms of disputing them, something you get a lower success rate on. But they are also something that Amazon often mischarges. So, for example, when we were just talking about that stock discrepancy piece of the shortages, when it's classed as being under on terms of the units, not only do they not pay you for them, they fine you for being wrong in terms of what you shipped in. So if you're able to overturn your shortage, you're also able to overturn your chargeback because they shouldn't have fined you for something that you weren't non-compliant on. Again, chargebacks have a very short dispute window, and I'll go a bit more into that further into the presentation. So seller fees. So this is a purely seller one. So seller fees is based off your category that you're in Amazon. So most categories have a referral fee of 15.3%, but that isn't true for every single category. And if your product gets miscategorized on upload, then you can actually end up paying the wrong seller fee. Something else that can happen with seller fees is there is a program called Launchpad. And something I've seen happen before is people sign up for Launchpad, companies change, people move around, people leave, and there is nothing internally in seller that tells you you are on Launchpad, and it bills you 5% on top of that referral fee. And it's effectively at that point becomes a hidden cost. So that's less on the recovery piece and more of a prevention going forward to improve profitability. And there's a few bits like that I'll be dropping in throughout this as well. And then the last part is terms. So this is partially co-op, partially things like early payment discounts, and is all to do with vendor, but I'll go more into that as we get further into this. So I've covered a little bit on this, but what are shortages? What are chargebacks? So really, shortages are best described as stock discrepancies. And shortages realistically lead to stock discrepancies lead to one of two things happening: Amazon under receiving or Amazon over receiving. And in both instances, that leads to chargebacks. So it's not a with a lot of this, you'll see that it's not a single problem and it's not a single solution. Amazon is a multi-system entity with lots of overlapping parts that compound and conflict with each other in many ways. So with the shortages, they only ever pay for what they believe they have received. And what you can do there is you can dispute these. You can go in and say there is an option to dispute them. They, for obvious reasons, don't like paying shortages because there's usually from their side a reason that they are not doing it. They in some way have misallocated the stock. They've misplaced it. They're becoming less trusting of things like PODs and manifests. If any of you submitted disputes, you've most probably seen Amazon come back with, we do not look at external PODs and manifests. And this is mostly true. There are times where they will, that is mostly true at this point, but there are things that you can do to push to try and actually get them to pay those out. And then with chargebacks, the main thing to be aware of with chargebacks is that the main aim of chargebacks is not the dispute point, it's the prevention point. So with chargebacks, there are a number of things that they bill for, and there are always going to be chargebacks on an account. I've seen a large number of vendor accounts, and it's pretty much impossible to go like an entire year with zero chargebacks. At some point, you're going to have a mistake. Your warehouse will be late on shipping. There'll be an order that was mispacked. Something will happen. Small amounts of chargebacks are manageable on an account, but what you're looking for is consistent fines that are happening, spikes in fines that are happening, and that indicates that there's a problem. So, for example, when I audit accounts, if I see a sudden spike in PO on-time accuracy, probably the most common chargeback, it usually is, oh, there was an issue with this courier, we were changing warehouses, we had a supply chain issue, something along the lines of that. And when you see that as the problem, you know that that's the thing that needs to be corrected. And often for some companies where they're using like a 3PL, for example, this is their first indication that something's gone wrong in their supply chain. So it's being able to react to that and say, this is what I need to do to prevent these going forward. Similarly, for things like oversized carton, overweight cartons, it's again more of a prevention piece, understanding what Amazon's policies are. And one of the really annoying things with this is even when you correct something, so for example, if you're being charged a prep charge like bubble wrap or boxing for a product, you can correct this, Amazon will then still bill you for it because they have an internal list of which products require that. So you have to actually request to be removed from the packaging list. So that when you make your corrections, document everything, say this is the changes that we've made. And when they then raise that charge back again, you have to dispute it, but specifically request to then be removed from the prep list. Because otherwise they will continue to bill this going forward, even though you've actually fixed the problem. So how to identify them, how to find when Amazon has done this. So it's slightly different for shortages. For the stock discrepancy piece, it is slightly different for seller versus vendor. For seller, you'll be able to see on FBA where there is a shortage. It's under the FBA receipt section of the portal where it shows this is what was going in, this is how much has been received, and you can raise a case log against that to say that this has been misreceived and they need to pay out for the stock they've effectively lost. And you can basically just push for a compensation claim there. For vendor, they have made it a bit more complicated. So I mentioned about the whole SCR aspect of how they classify these things. So what that looks like is, let's say you sent in 10 of an item for £10 each, and you would invoice them then for £100. It comes up to the end of your payment terms, and Amazon goes, here is £50, we only received 5 items. In practice, what that means is they will put a shortage claim, which will be labeled as the invoice number plus the letters SC, and they will credit off that invoice. And that invoice at that point gets closed out, and that £50 paid to you. What the system then does is create a new invoice, and it's under an invoice hierarchy. So when you go into the invoices, you can see them all labeled next to each other, and you can click into them. And they will create a new invoice labeled invoice number SCR, where the R stands for reversal, and that'll be for that £50. What can then happen is that they can then go, for example, a month later, we found another one, and they'll pay you for that one unit. They will then create invoice number SCR, SC, and then they'll create a new invoice and add an R onto the end of that. And you end up with an ever increasing invoice number. And as I mentioned, the longest I've seen of that is 14 instances of it. And what happens in the last part of this, so that final invoice where you've got an amount that they are still sat on, one of two things can happen. Either they don't create it, and I've seen instances of that happen. So you're able to find it. So if you go into your original invoice, you can go down the invoice hierarchy and see that there is something that should have been created. And you can see that on the one before it, there was an amount not paid. But the actual physical, well, not physical, but digital footprint of that invoice is no longer there. And it's either they don't create it or that they delete it. And I've seen them do both. I've seen some that were there and then disappear after 3 months. And that practice means that there isn't an option for historic shortages to actually just pull a list of what is still there, which is why it's so difficult to actually go through and work out what's happening. So the only way to really manage this is on an ongoing basis, keeping up with all of the shortages as they happen. And then for anything historic, you have to download all of your invoices. And you can do this up to about 5 years. After going beyond the 5-year point, Amazon will actually basically say, why are you disputing this? Their records don't go that far back. They start archiving after that point. If you are looking at anything further back than that, you are just going to hit a wall of resistance and have a very low success rate for a much higher level of effort. So what you can do is download your 5 years worth of invoices. And what you're looking for is where the invoice trail stops, but the money has not been fully paid. And that's how we identify these as we go through and we look for that discrepancy. We're looking for that instance where there's still that £30–40 at the end of the invoice that hasn't been paid. So let's just carry on from that £100. And as obviously we're looking for values hopefully a bit higher than £30–40. So that's the shortages piece. So it's depending on the size of an account, it can be quite an exercise to process that level of data. Which is why I recommend trying to get it to a point where you can then manage it on an ongoing monthly basis as they happen. Chargebacks is a bit different. So for chargebacks, I recommend looking at these, if not weekly, on at least a fortnightly basis, just because you have such a short dispute window in terms of the chargebacks. And what you can do there is, again, you can download all of them. You can sort by ATTNs and you can see what are the repeat offenders, what are the common reasons, is this a spike compared to previously? And you're again looking for that prevention piece. What can you do to prevent these going forward? And then with both of these, there are options to dispute, which I'll get into the actual how you dispute it in a second as we go through this. But yeah, with that chargeback piece, it's more of a continuous watching and prevention piece. And with chargebacks especially, but with everything, it's a root cause analysis. What has caused this to happen? And there are things, even with shortages, that you can do to try and prevent, not so much prevent, but make them more manageable. So with vendor in particular, one of the things vendor does is it makes up its own terminology. So for example, Amazon vendor does not use the term minimum order quantity. They instead use case packs. That's what they've literally just substituted the words minimum order quantity for case pack. So if you ask Amazon, I want to put a minimum order quantity on for this product, they'll say can't be done. Don't do minimum order quantities. And to a point, they're right. They do case packs. So you can say you need to order a case pack of X. And what that does is means rather than Amazon going, I'll take 1, I'll take 5, I'll take 10, you can say, no, you have to take 20. And that means that your warehouse has a standard packaging that they are doing. So they're not having to split up cases, not split up amounts. So it makes it a lot easier for them, removes any possibility they're the ones making the mistake. But it also means that you're having to deal with less orders. You're not doing 1 here, 5 there, 10 there. You're doing 20 to here, 20 to here. It cuts down how many orders you've got to keep track of to see how many shortages you have to deal with. Just makes it a little bit more manageable, both on the shortages and the chargebacks, and overall helps profitability. So how to get these back? So in terms of shortages and chargebacks, there's a couple of different bits. So PODs and manifests should still be used. Amazon still states that they don't use them, but it is still best practice to include them. The reason for this is that it shows Amazon that you have a genuine belief that it has gone in. It's more of a confidence piece than it is actually a piece of trying to use the evidence. It's something to say you are very convinced. Having that paperwork and being able to say that there is a clear trail shows Amazon that you are less likely to just back down and drop this, that you aren't just taking a chance on this. And if you are on top of this and regularly going through these and actually going through and doing them on a regular basis, it takes about 3 weeks for Amazon to actually go through and process shortages. That is definitely not true for the historic, which is why I recommend getting to a point where you are doing these on a regular working basis. For the historic, you are talking months. I've had accounts that I've looked at where it's taken 6 months just to get Amazon to go through the list of shortages, let alone to actually make any form of payment back. And it's important with any messaging to Amazon to be incredibly clear. The case log departments in Amazon, as you probably are all aware, are rushing through tickets. They are looking for key phrases, key points to be able to identify what they're doing, and they're just looking to get the quickest resolution to a ticket and to get that ticket closed off. Just because you get told what no once on a ticket does not mean they will not do it. Sometimes they're just in a rush and they haven't even read your request properly. So it's really important to have a clear, concise messaging of what you are sending them and why. Chargebacks, as I mentioned, lower recovery rate for the simple reason that they are usually and this is why prevention is more important. It's more about preventing being billed this in the future than it is about trying to get it back. If you're outside of a PO window, you're not going to be able to dispute that. You can dispute it, but you'll have a low success rate because you are outside of that window. Amazon doesn't really care the excuse. There are times where you will get lucky and have some success in there. And so if you've got the time to be able to go through and do that, no real harm in disputing every charge as it comes through. As I say, it's more of a prevention piece there. So on the prevention and planning, so I've gone into this a little bit. Shortages for the stock, making sure that you understand where your stock has gone, knowing that it has gone in, that if you are able to see that your stock has gone in, if you're able to know what has happened exactly, you'll be able to know when that stock has gone in, you'll be able to say that stock has arrived within certain timeframes and windows. It'll just being able to track all of your delivery and have things like your case pack aligned, while you'll never get to a point where you will reduce shortages and chargebacks to nil for a couple of reasons. Firstly, just as you scale, there will be mistakes that happen, but also because, especially with the stock discrepancy piece, as I mentioned about Amazon software, a lot of the discrepancy is actually from Amazon's side. It's less your warehouse making a mistake and more Amazon making the mistake. And I can get a bit more into that near the end of this presentation around how much is usually a discrepancy across the board of these things. So moving out of vendor a second into seller. So I went over this a little bit at the start. So with seller, there are a couple of different fees. So all seller accounts will have referral fees. And they are, as I mentioned, based off your category. And there is an additional one such with Launchpad. And there is also the possibility of Amazon just making a mistake. And I've seen all three of these things happen. So I've seen accounts where people have listed products up and just through sheer error, just when you go through, you fill in your flat file, you go to add a product, or your product was previously listed by resellers, you go to add the product, And just for the sake of convenience, you go with the subcategory that has been used there, or the first category you find that looks basically correct. And the problem is, because there are these different fees attached, if you've picked a category, or if a category has been picked for you that is incorrect, that can be misbilled. And because it's a percentage of each sale as they happen, you're effectively overpaying for every single one of those sales as they happen. And then similarly with Launchpad, I mentioned this at the beginning, it's a bolt-on program. It has its advantages, but it also does not have a set end date. Launchpad will keep running until you ask to be removed from it. And Launchpad, while being its own platform on Amazon, the fee is applied to every sale you make on Amazon, not just through the Launchpad program. And I've seen accounts before where they're not actually making any sales through Launchpad anymore. They've been through Launchpad, they've completed Launchpad, they don't need Launchpad anymore. But just because they haven't cancelled it, they were paying 5% of every sale through Amazon just because they hadn't sent a message saying, please end Launchpad. Now, if this isn't a recovery, there is no chance of getting that money back because the contract clearly states with Launchpad, it keeps applying until you ask for it to be cancelled. What you can at least do is prevent this from going forward. To be able to cancel it in case anyone needs to, you just raise a case log saying you would like to be removed from Amazon Launchpad, and that is your 30-day notice period. So you will still be continuing to pay that 5% for 30 days, even once you cancel. And so moving on to the last one, which is error. Amazon is not perfect, despite what they try and claim. They do make mistakes with their billing, and this is not just with referral fees, this is across the board. They can just miscalculate, and it's a depressing thing, but it is always worth just doing, even if it's quarterly exercise, spot check your seller fees, just make sure the referral fee hasn't been miscalculated. And it might not even be by a huge amount, but on large accounts where it's even out by half or 1%, half or 1% really can stack up over time. So then I'm moving on to FBA fulfillment fee, which is probably actually the more common area that I see the problems with seller. FBA fulfillment fee, there is again an issue that can happen with setup, which is around the dimensions and the weights that are provided on the setup piece. If these are wrong, Amazon does remeasure, but they only use that measure for their own internal calculations, not for billing. So even though they will update it internally and say this is what needs to be done to store and package it, they will actually still continue to bill based off what was originally entered. So the worst example I've ever seen on this was somebody was selling a set of scarves, and rather than putting in the package dimension of the scarf on upload, they'd put in the rolled out dimension of the scarf, and for some reason still set the thickness as if it was packaged. So they were they'd entered in the dimensions as if the thing was a lump of timber and were being billed couple of £100 for the scarves when it should have been 10 to £20. And same for all of the FBA fulfillment fees as these things were being shipped out. So with this, you can audit your dimensions, and the request here is for Amazon to remeasure and to apply this to the FBA fees. And that's the two steps that they need to take internally. So they will remeasure and they will reweigh all the products. They will update it internally. Once that is done, you then have to ask for them to refund. They won't automatically do it. And it is a slow process, can take 1 to 2 months for them to actually reimburse based off those. So this is also true for the storage piece. So in terms of how to do this and how to actually get this data, so there's a couple of places you can look at. So the transaction report on seller is actually quite good for this. It does give you a breakdown of the fees that you have paid, both as the referral fee and the FBA fee. So you can get a list of all of the transactions that you have done from there. You can use the fee calculator that Amazon provides. So you can see what fees should have been applied and what FBA should be attached to it. And you can compare those to what has been put onto the transaction report. Things like the category listings report can also be used. That will tell you which category the products have been listed into, and you can see if what is listed there matches what should be there. And with all of this, you're looking to compare the reality of what you're being billed with where it should be. So you're just trying to audit effectively and bring the two things into alignment. And once you have all of this, there is not a dedicated dispute section in seller for this. It is through case logs. You have to raise case logs asking for them to go through and do this. Best practice for this is once you've found the discrepancies in the amounts, create a spreadsheet that has each of the transactions and the amount that you've been overbilled. put that as just a consolidated list, make Amazon's life easy with this, because they would, unless you do, they just won't do it. That's the unfortunate reality of it. And with the messaging, just very clearly, based on my calculations, our rates should have been X. They've been misapplied. Please reimburse us for this amount. And that, again, will probably take 1 to 2 months for them to actually go through and do this. They are never quick on these levels of recovery. Moving back into vendor and onto the co-op pieces. So co-ops are, as I mentioned, programs that you have with Amazon. They are set to auto-renew every year, and as any vendor here will know, around either this time of year or more commonly early next year, they will start to ask to negotiate these terms. So with the co-op terms, there are a couple of things that can happen. So around this time of year, I actually always recommend doing a very brief audit of your terms. This is the most common time of year that Amazon will actually just bring in terms without even making you aware of them. And you can find a term just spontaneously appear on your account. And if that does happen, you do need to dispute it relatively quickly. It becomes a lot harder to remove once it has been there for a while. And also you've then been billed for that co-op and you need to try and claim that money back. At least now you can prevent it from billing. Co-ops are calculated using a percentage of revenue, and they're based off the number of units that Amazon has received. So going back to what we said on the stock discrepancy piece, where Amazon misreceives the stock, the problem is that Amazon doesn't always use the correct stock figure to be able to do this calculation. Sometimes they will actually use the figure of what was requested rather than what was actually received. And what that can effectively lead to is you being billed for units that Amazon hasn't actually said they are willing to pay you for. They can also just calculate off the wrong percentage, and I've seen that done before. And the worst of all is that I've seen people billed when there isn't even an agreement. So the co-op is being charged, but the agreement is still sat as pending or was never even raised and created. So all of these things are just worth auditing and worth checking. This is what I mean with the erroneous versus overbilled. So with erroneous, this is you should not have been billed it in the first place. And you can check this by looking at your agreements. Something else that you can do on the co-ops page is if you see an agreement and you're not sure what it is for, on the right-hand side where it has like the download option, if you go to agreement text, if that doesn't pull anything up or comes up with an error just saying cannot find agreement or has provisional agreement, see rate card, you do not have an agreement in place. And it's slightly different depending on if you see an error or if you see the provisional. If you see error, screenshot that, send it to support, they will refund you. If you see provisional, your agreement expired, but they didn't raise a new one. This is something we usually only see in the US, but it can happen to any account. They will then start billing you off a standard rate card, which is traditionally higher than the co-op fees that they will usually agree with you. What you can do is you can push for a new agreement to be put in place, and they will backdate that agreement and refund you for the time period where you're being billed off the rate card. And for overbilling, similarly to the previous ones we were talking about, spreadsheets pull the data, compare what was actually billed versus what should have been billed, and you're looking for that discrepancy piece. And when you have those, you are pushing for Amazon to reverse these charges. So again, this is a case log situation. There isn't really a dispute section for this. It's best to just do it through case logs. And you can pull, so I've got the note here for the overbuild, you're looking for the backup report. That's the only report that actually gives you the line-by-line items. Every other report just gives you a summary. So the last piece on here, which is less about recovery and is more of a profitability and prevention piece in terms of Amazon itself. So this is predominantly, again, vendor. I mentioned about the co-op piece, and there are many different co-ops, just some general ones: marketing, allowances, whether it be damage or overstock, VIR, which is your volume incentive rebate. Some have a Vine program or AVS, which is the Amazon vendor services, and collect shipping, and then a slightly separate one, which is the early payment discount. With these, yes, you can audit them, check you're not being overbilled. But actually, the biggest question is, are you happy with the percentages? And in some cases, do you even need them? Vine as an agreement is, unless you are constantly launching new brands, Vine as an agreement only makes sense in year one of trading. It's an expensive term. You don't need Vine unless you're constantly launching new products. You can't use it on products that already have a number of existing reviews, caps out at 30 reviews. So there's no point in continuing to pay a percentage of revenue for a term that you are no longer getting an advantage on. Same is true for the different allowances and things like the marketing allowance in particular, which we never see a breakdown of where Amazon spends that. It is just Amazon's own internal margin. These can only really be negotiated when Amazon comes to negotiate on these things, but it's just to keep in mind what they're for and how useful they are. But the main one actually I want to focus on within this is the early payment discount. Most accounts Amazon pushes to set up an early payment discount for. So for those that are not aware of what that is Amazon will say, we'll pay you in 60 days, but if you let us have a 2% discount, we'll pay you in 30 days. There's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, most companies would prefer the 2% to 30 days. And the other problem with it is even if Amazon pays outside of that 30 days, they will still take that 2%. Their system is just that broken. So when I was talking about the shortages and all of the other things, they will still apply that 2%, and you will have to then ask them to refund it. They will. It's just an unnecessary thing for you to have to go and do. The bigger problem with it is it's just not needed by most companies, like I say. And there are alternatives. There is a program called C2FO, which is a direct partner to Amazon at this point, which allows you to selectively choose which ones you want to offer a discount on to get the cash in faster. So with the early payment discount, if you have one, I recommend trying to get it removed. It's usually something you can negotiate out of being in. And like I say, it's generally not worth having on an account. And if you do need that time period, things like C2FO are just a better solution. So I've actually just gone into that without going on to the slides. I'll just skip that one. How to negotiate? Because I realize I've just said effectively go negotiate with Amazon. And as we discussed at the beginning of this, Amazon is one of the biggest companies in the world and a difficult company to deal with. Talk about customer impact. So what I mean by that is if they don't give you these margins, you will not be able to supply the product anymore, or you will have to cut down how much you supply the product, or you'd have to raise your RRP. Things you don't want to do because it will impact the customer. Talk about what you'll do with the money. So a great one to say is we don't want to put the 5% into your marketing. We have our own campaigns we plan to launch. We want to run our promotions. We plan to launch these new lines. We plan to run promotions, all of these different things. It's just asking for a discount with Amazon doesn't work. They need to be able to give a justification and a case for it. And ultimately, be prepared to take a stand and have a backup plan. Amazon vendor is slow, they're very difficult, and the only times I've seen people really successfully negotiate with them is when they've said, we will not supply to you until you do something about this. And the backup plan is a seller account. Have other ways of continuing to trade so that you don't have your listing just sat there, no stock, falling down the sales rank. It works, but it means that you've tanked your listing and you lose out on effectively those sales while you're going through this process. Okay, I think that's roughly how long I was meant to take for this presentation. So I'll open up to any questions.
That was fascinating. Absolutely. I mean, I don't obviously sit on an Amazon account trading every day, but it's so complex. And I have a couple of sarcastic questions that you don't have to answer. One is okay. How legal are their practices? And the second one is, do they have a let's make it complicated department that sits down every week and figure out another way to make it difficult? You don't have to answer.
No, I'll give a very. I recognize the comedy of the questions, but it's funny how accurate some of that is. So in terms of the actual legality of some of it, it's not. There are plenty of practices Amazon takes with these things that are not legal. Certain things they do, such as provision for receivables, which we didn't even go into today on as a way of holding on to money, is not legal. And there have been instances of being legally challenged on these things. Biggest problem with it is if you go down that route is they will just remove you as a seller or vendor. They really don't like people taking them to those points, and they're big enough that people are better off with them than without them in most cases. And as for do they sit down together and come up with how to make it more difficult? I think the problem is that they don't. The problem is that they have individual departments, individual programs, and none of them actually communicate internally.
They've grown to such a size and they're operating in silo.
Deliberately. As anybody here who's contacted support will know, you call, you ask about something, they'll say different department, can't transfer you, can't take it. That department doesn't have a phone number. That department won't take calls. It's an absolute nightmare and a minefield.
Yeah. Okay. So we've had a question. How do we download the report for chargebacks? Apologies, no microphone. Oh, I didn't need to hear that.
Yeah, that's so within the vendor portal, you go to reports, operational performance, and that will give you a dashboard that shows you your charges for that time period. And on the right-hand side, top right corner of that page, you'll see a section that allows you to view the transactions in full. You'll get a detailed list and you can download a CSV from there for up to a year.
Thank you.
No problem.
Does anybody else have any specific questions? I've got a few to ask. Anybody got any sort of operational things that they'd like to ask? No, mine are a bit more generic, really, in terms of, you know, is there a percentage, or how much money do you think is generally recoverable for an account?
It's a good question. So seller accounts, it varies massively based on how they've been set up. There's almost always something with seller accounts to be recovered. One I didn't even really touch on today is the returns piece, because that's just another complete mess within Amazon is how they handle returns, but that's usually an area on seller where there is something to be recovered, where they've misplaced returns. For vendor, as a general rule, I find about 2% of revenue has been overcharged or misbilled.
And that can be quite a lot, can't it? 2%. Yeah. Okay.
That's fairly consistent going back over several years. So one thing I didn't mention was how far back you can go with this for everything. So shortages, 5 years. Other stock discrepancies, about 3 years. For co-ops, 5 years. And for seller, you've got your FBA, which is 90 days. And for the fees, you can go back 2 or 3 years.
I've had another question. How to fight bulk buy allowance claims?
Bulk buy allowance claims. So this is where you've accepted bulk buys. So, I mean, I generally don't advise accepting bulk buys on vendor, partly because it leads to problems like this. When Amazon puts in a bulk buy, bulk buys only happen on vendor. So vendor is a very pessimistic platform. If it's put in a bulk buy, it's because it's going to be placing that order organically in that next time period. The other problem with bulk buys is because you're giving them a discount to do that. They see that you have margin to be able to give them a discount. They are also having to store that stock for longer, which means it's hitting the profitability of that item, which means they then are going, we actually need more margin to be able to sell this. And you have then just told them you have more margin to give them. So what it leads to is an unfortunate circular spiral of them actually trying to just lower prices. In regards to if they've put through a bulk buy, I'm not sure I actually understand this exact question. Because when Amazon puts through a bulk buy, you either accept or decline it. If you've accepted it, then you just have purchase orders raised at that value. There shouldn't be an additional claim unless there's something else to that question.
Maybe, is this something that I can put you in touch with?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll see who's asking it, and then, see if there's anything you can help with. Another question: how do you remove an item? Oh, it's gone. How do you remove an item from the prep list? And could you please explain it further, as we get a prep report from the vendor and use this to guide us when prepping items? If they are no longer needed prep, how would we know?
Okay, so that's a good question. So with prep, you get a couple of different things. So you can have things like bubble wrap, you can have things like cardboard, whatever they need to actually put around the item. So Amazon has many, many different fulfillment centers, and some of you shipping these things in have probably seen that some fulfillment centers will flag you for things, others won't. And with prep in particular, because they know that their fulfillment centers are not great, they basically have a list internally of this product will need prep when it turns up. So once you've been flagged, especially through vendor, they are more likely to then flag it again because you will be on this list. Well, I'll just go, it's coming, we are going to need to apply this. So when you have corrected it, so when you've gone through and you've done this exercise of internally going through and putting bubble wrap, putting it into a box, when you next ship it in, when they raise that chargeback, you want to put in photos saying, so when you have the chargeback, there's an option on it to dispute. So you raise a dispute against that chargeback saying, I have done X to make it so that this is no longer an issue. Please see images here. Please remove me from the prep list so that I'm not build this going forward. And just if that then continues, you keep that going forward and you escalate it through case logs if they continue to be a problem.
Thank you. Another question. We used to have a dedicated vendor manager and were able to negotiate prices. However, we have now lost our vendor manager. How can we restart your price negotiations again when you've lost your vendor manager?
Good question, and a depressingly common problem. Vendor managers disappear off of platforms quite consistently. They do not stick around for long. So cost prices on Amazon are a really difficult thing to push through, and they fall into the same kind of category of what we were just discussing with the terms. So it follows exactly the same rules. So with this, Amazon has actually recently, I think it's within the last 6 months, brought out a new version of the item cost sheet. So this is where you can upload a new cost. And within that, you're able to specify what percentage of this is due to labor, what percentage is due to materials increase, what percentage is due to packaging increase, and you can split that out across them. Filling this in does seem to have a higher success rate. Beyond this, you can basically take this stance of you will not supply. Not having the vendor manager does make it much, much harder. Depending on the size of the account, you've got some other options within it. So if the account is at a point where you could start asking about things like ABS, then you could potentially look, is that 3% or 2, 3, 4%, whatever you end up agreeing for your ABS percentage, would that percentage be outweighed by the cost prices that you would be pushing for? So ABS is something that Amazon's really pushing to try and get people onto at this point. And one of the things that you can do as part of your negotiation on going on to ABS is see it's the prerequisite for you going on to it is that you need these price increases. And I've seen them actually go to a point of being more in favor profitability-wise for accounts if ABS is added because they've got some internal quotas to hit by the looks of it to get people signed up to ABS.
Thank you. And we've got one more. We'll just take one more. Is the PO on time accuracy chargeback due to courier late deliveries? And if this happens, do you know if there's a way to keep the PO open so they can still deliver on that PO? That's very specific.
Yeah, good question. So PO on time accuracy, there's actually 2 definitions depending on how the item is shipped in. If it is a carton that is shipped in by a courier such as DPD, UPS, or any of the others, then it is when that parcel arrives at their fulfillment center. If it's being delivered by a palletized, as a pallet by a pallet carrier, they are actually required to book in. So there's another portal called Carrier Central, and the pallet company needs to go there with the purchase order number and say this is what they're delivering in. And your PO on time accuracy for that is not based on it when it is received, but on when it is booked in through that portal. So if you raise a shipment and you say to your pallet company, we want you to deliver this, and they contact Amazon, say tomorrow, let's say you got your PO yesterday, you got it all packaged up, it's going today, pallet company picks it up, needs to be there by Friday, and they say to Amazon, we want to deliver, and Amazon goes, can't take it this week, we'll take it next week. That's not your fault, that's Amazon's. You are still within your PO on time accuracy window because you told Amazon within the window what you wanted to do. And if you still get a chargeback then, you can get the documentation from the courier to say they booked in, and you can dispute that. In regards to the delivery window is open for that week, but it will stay open longer. So one of the things you can do to extend the delivery window a bit is actually by creating the shipment. So when you've created a shipment against a purchase order, that is an intent to Amazon that you are delivering it in. While they have all of these rules, they do also understand that delays happen. And they will usually keep a purchase order open for about 2 weeks beyond that PO window and still allow the stock to be going in. At this point, you will then start to receive emails from Amazon saying purchase order pending cancellation, and they will tell you the date that will happen. If you cancel it after that delivery window, but before the cancellation date, you will get a 3% charge for cancellation outside of your window. But if you let it run to the end and it is still not delivered in and Amazon cancels it, it's a 9% charge at that point. Technically, at this point, Amazon will still receive the delivery. So if it then goes in and is received, you can then overturn the 9% charge and have it reduced to a 3%. So I realised that was a bit of a lengthy answer.
No, but I think there's a question here. Thank you. It's a comment. Thank you, Stephen, for your knowledge about Amazon processes. Yeah, fascinating. I mean, gosh, you've got a lot of knowledge inside your head there about Amazon.
It has taken a little while, and yeah, Amazon is a absolute monster of a business,
Yeah,
and they've made things very complicated. But
yeah,
the last thing that I'll kind of add with all of this is while we do all of these webinars and everything to try and help people be able to overcome this, we do recognize that what I've gone through today, there is a lot to take in. There's a lot of different aspects. And it's actually why as an agency, we've launched up services to be able to go through and do these disputes and to be able to go through and actually reclaim all of these things as well. So we do have options to look at the accounts and audit them and find all of this for people.
yes, of course. And you know, as exactly as you said, you have a service that helps to do this, don't you? It's like a no win, no fee system, that audit that you can put in place, quite forensic audit, isn't it, in terms of offering a service on that. So thank you very much. It feels like we need to do a clinic, like a drop-in clinic on Amazon on anything, and get you there so people can just fire loads of different questions at you on all sorts.
I'd be happy to do that.
Perhaps we'll pick up that idea later, but thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for all of your questions as well. You know,
and
if
Vicky,
there's
thank you
anything
from
else,
us. Thank you from RT7 as well. I've also left a link in the chat for individuals to go on to and register. We do an audit in this environment, and we can help brands actually find all of their money owed. So click on that link if you need to as well.
Thank you. And we'll put that in the follow-up as well when we send out a copy of the webinar and the slides as well. But thank you very much for your time, Mike and Stephen.